Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Crysler. Each episode, we talk to business leaders and subject matter experts to learn about the challenges they've overcome and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business. Every operator I talk to says that they want to be more efficient, and it makes complete sense why. The problem is that what they're actually seeking isn't efficiency, it's effectiveness. And the difference between those two words may seem minor and they get used interchangeably quite often, but I would argue that we've been taught to seek efficiency, and it's been the pretty much entire demise of our ability to really move the needle within our organizations and for our customers, right? Because that's ultimately why we exist, to deliver value to our customers. So the reason I say that chasing, efficiency is why operators and leaders and owners stay stuck is because everybody is used to identifying the symptoms, and the symptoms often point to inefficiency. And because all of us have been trained, myself included, by the way, it took me a really long time to learn this, but because we've all been trained to seek efficiency within our area of responsibility, right? And we've never been responsible to zoom out across the organization to understand the impact of our siloed decision across the organization. That's how we've kind of gotten to this place, right? And while you can argue that, senior leadership's role is to make sure that, from a strategic perspective, that we're all kind of driving towards the same thing, when you go into almost any organization and you start to get into the middle management layer and below, you will see witness of what I'm talking about through this siloed decision making and localized efficiency, right? The best example I can give you is if you think about your business, right? No matter if you're a manufacturing business or a service-based business, you can very easily kind of think of things as like front of house, right? So customer facing, right? Or client facing, if we're talking about a service-based business generally, but kind of things that happen in the front end of that business and then things that happen in the back end, right? Like the delivery mechanisms, right? Fulfillment. And so if you think about it just from those two perspectives, when you have somebody that is responsible for the front end of the business, what are they looking to do? They're looking to optimize locally, right? They don't really care what happens in the back because it's out of their, domain, right? It's out of their area of responsibility, and vice versa. And depending on how big your org is, how many layers you have, how many, different folks across the leadership spectrum you have all of these like individualized areas of responsibility, and everybody is seeking to localize everybody is seeking efficiency within that, kind of local domain. Right. So that's kind of how we got to this place. And as I said at the beginning of the episode, I was no different when I was coming up into leadership. Right. I had a pretty typical trajectory of that where, my first role was a supervisory role, and I had, a handful of people that reported to me. And, so on and so forth, right? I continued to expand the area of responsibility. So it started with one department, then multiple departments, direct reports, indirect reports. And so as that grew, right, my kind of purview for efficiency, it grew as well, but I was still focused, from a localized perspective, right? My responsibility was to make the departments, and the folks that reported to me as efficient as possible. And I'd argue that that's that thing that ultimately held us back because, I was doing that and the 4 or 5 other people that were at my level were doing that as well. And then when I got to a P&L, level, right, and I had an entire facility that was reporting to me, it was the same thing said a different way, right? We were doing that localized efficiency at the facility level, right? And there were a bunch of other people at my level trying to do those same things. And, so it applies regardless of kind of where you're at. And until you can shift your focus away from efficiency to effectiveness, right, you're going to continue to struggle. So one of the other things that I learned kind of, coming up, right, was efficiency. We talked about efficiency and effectiveness, but utilization as kind of the third leg of the stool. And when I was coming up and learning a lot about this stuff, we talked a lot about efficiency and utilization. And those two kind of, core metrics around understanding how productive, we were as a facility and kind of zoomed all the way down to the individual contributor level, right? Work center level, individual contributor level. And, ultimately what we were trying to do was increase effectiveness, although we weren't talking about it through that lens, right? I kind of later came to understand what we were actually trying to do. And I would argue that even the efficiency and utilization lens that we were putting on it still made us focused in that localized manner, right? Once I started to learn about seeking effectiveness, increasing flow, generating throughput, running to the kind of demand of the customer. Once I started to learn all of those things, it started to finally make sense that, all of the efforts we were putting towards improving were really just localized efficiency. And so when we thought we were, moving the needle, we really weren't, right? We were internally. We felt like we were doing something. There was activity. There was, a change in metrics. So it felt meaningful internally, right? But externally, if we zoomed out and measured it through the lens of the customer, right, we weren't doing anything significant when it came to, increasing throughput or, reducing, cycle times or lead times significantly, right? We'd still have backlog. We'd still, from time to time have, product quality issues and those types of things, right? So just to make sure we're all on the same page, let's talk about, these 3 terms, right? Efficiency is kind of a measure of, one station, doing things right, if you will, right? It's like, if the standard is 8 hours and we did it in 8 hours, we were 100% efficient, right? And if we did it in 6 hours, we were more efficient. If we did it in 10 hours, we were less efficient, right? So that is efficiency. It's a very localized metric, and sure, you can apply it more broadly, but that's really what efficiency is telling you. Now, utilization, on the other hand, is how busy or how much, that resource is being utilized. Right. So when I was coming up, we talked a lot about earned hours. Right. So earned hours is how we calculated utilization, because, if we sold X number of hours on a specific resource, right, that would get us to 80-90% utilization. And that was the target. If we could hit 80% utilization and 95% efficiency, we thought we were doing great. And we were at a localized, kind of level, right? The effectiveness is kind of what combines all of the efficiency and utilization, but it's really through the lens of the customer, right? So it's it's I have a colleague that, and I've shared this before, but I have a colleague that uses the example of a rowing team to illustrate effectiveness and the difference of effectiveness versus efficiency, right? So if you think about a rowing team, you can have somebody that is able to row significantly faster, right? But if you have one person on the rowing team that's able to row significantly faster, it doesn't get you to your destination any faster. It actually makes the boat spin, right? So it actually takes you off course, okay? Whereas effectiveness, you have everybody rowing to that same pace, right? So that's the beat or the demand of the customer, right? So that is what we're talking about with, with effectiveness. And I would say the biggest or most counterintuitive part about thinking through increasing flow and increasing throughput is the fact that we have to get out of the mindset of localized efficiency. Because in order to achieve flow, right, we have to have some resources or touch points that are ultimately less efficient. And this is a really hard concept for people to wrap their head around because, we've been taught, right? We've kind of, as I said, it's like we've grown up understanding that we need to seek localized efficiency. And come to find out, if we're actually seeking effectiveness, if we're looking to, improve throughput, increase flow, and kind of run to the demand of the customer, that certain touch points throughout our value stream, right, need to be less efficient than wherever our bottleneck or our constraints end up being, right? And I don't want to make this a deep dive into kind of theory of constraints and seeking bottlenecks and solving for them. But just know that that is the biggest unlock when you are starting to go down this path, is that this shift away from this localized efficiency and always seeking efficiency to seeking effectiveness. That is where the unlock happens. And, really cool things can happen, when you start to do that, right? Like the most recent client example that we have with this is a custom manufacturing company that was, had a growing backlog, had turn times in the, 30 to 45 day range. And, within a matter of a couple of months, we were able to basically eliminate their backlog. We were able to, shift their lead times from that 30 to 45 days somewhere down to the, 5 to 10 day range. And, we were able to do that with no additional resources. That's the other part that makes this stuff so cool, is that, localized efficiency often requires additional resources, right? It could require additional capital to be invested for equipment or software. It could even require additional, human capital to be allocated. But when we start to shift away from that and move towards effectiveness, by applying some relatively simple kind of tools and frameworks, right, then we're able to see these gains, right? 30, 40, 50% gain in capacity, utilizing all of the same resources. And that client that I mentioned, they actually had some natural attrition happen during this same time. So they increased their capacity significantly with actually less resources than what they started with. Again, just through some natural attrition. And because they were already starting to see the gains, there was no reason to, replace those folks that ultimately had, left. And again, I think that's something that is not typical. And I think that's why you don't hear a lot of people talking about the difference between efficiency and effectiveness. You don't even really hear a lot of people honestly talk about utilization. I mean, I remember, again, when I was coming up, That seemed like a foreign concept to me, that we were, ultimately measuring how much resource was being utilized. And I remember kind of feeling like, oh, wow, now we have this whole other data point to better understand, how we're taking advantage or not taking advantage of this specific resource, how that ultimately impacted our costs, right? Because again, I grew up in an industry, in the print industry, but I grew up in an industry where, oftentimes it was kind of like we used to lead with the shiny new, printing press, or the shiny new, technology that was, changing the game for the industry. And so learning just about utilization helped me to better understand how that impacted our cost structure, so we could ultimately, have competitive pricing, right? But back then we were focused on kind of, maximizing margin. So it was like, that was, a piece of the puzzle, if you will, that now, after having done this stuff for nearly 30 years, I'm finally starting to connect all of the dots to see, just how we're able to, again, like, move the needle for companies that are looking to, to not just grow, but to kind of, unlock this sustainable growth, right? Because it's one thing to, kind of do this work in the back. And then what you quickly realize is that, okay, great. We were able to increase our capacity, our throughputs increased, our lead times have been reduced significantly. We have no backlog. Well, what does that mean? Now we got to focus, on the front end of the business. We got to get more orders into the hopper, right? So it kind of, again, is this unique teeter-totter effect where, we focused on increasing the overall effectiveness of one, kind of area of the business. And then that shifted the constraint to a new area of the business. Now we can apply those same thought processes to that area of the business. And then at some point it will go back, right? Where we've got such an increase in, assuming that there is market demand, right? But now we have such an increase in orders that we have to kind of reevaluate. And it's not really reevaluating. It's actually just, increasing the number of resources and doing more of the same, right? Continuing to synchronize flow and ultimately get product out, get more product out the door. Again, I think the other thing to unpack, with this particular topic is, and I touched on it in terms of, not needing any additional resources, but a lot of people will think about this problem, again, through the lens of a symptom and say, we have a scheduling problem, right? That's the major issue. We're not scheduling efficiently. So let's take a look at a tool that helps us schedule more efficiently, right? And again, that's how we get ourselves into so much trouble with this stuff, because we're solving at the symptom level. So what do? We go and we purchase a scheduling software. We have all the configuration and implementation headaches of that scheduling software. And when we, kind of zoom out 6 months, 12 months, 18 months later, we have the same exact problem, right? We didn't increase our ability to deliver orders to our customers any quicker. That scheduling software didn't help us, increase capacity. And so we're still left with, trying to solve for that, right? Add more people, add overtime, add equipment, and all of that stuff, not just chews up, investment capital, right? But it eats margin, right? And cash. So that's, ultimately how I ended up coming to learn, so much about these things, kind of through all the different iterations of learning. And, if you're interested, as a reminder, each one of these episodes is an extension of our free weekly newsletter, Business System Saturday. So I'd encourage you to go to the website and check out the links there and to subscribe. Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode, and we'll catch you on the next one. Thanks. Thank you so much for listening today. If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Crysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Crysler.